Okay, we'll just wait for the car to drive off there. There, it's gone. Welcome to Brooklands, and welcome to tonight's event. You will have seen Homer Simpson there. If you followed his instructions, you won't be able to get out of that door because it's locked, because they haven't quite finished those stairs yet, even though they've been doing them for months. So the fire exit is the main one at the back there. If the bells do go off, it won't be a drill. So that is the exit to take. Tonight's event is about a little known person, I guess, in the annals of history at Brooklands. We don't see too much on the medical side of Brooklands written about at all. But tonight we're going to look at Dr. Gardner, the amazing Dr. Gardner, in fact. And Brooklands member Steve McCarthy is going to come forward now from the back and make an entrance. And he's going to tell us all about the amazing Dr. Gardner. Well done, Steve. Good luck.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, mic's on. Good, good. Right. So, yes, I'm just a local Weybridge person. I'll just give you a little bit of background as to why I'm here doing this. I have another talk which is called Brooklands Through the Ages, which is about 1,000 years worth of history leading up to this track and everything. And when I was doing that, I came across this guy, Eric Gardner, all sorts of references to him. Shortly after I produced this talk, the Elbridge Museum, which used to be just in Weybridge, 10 minutes from my house, just stroll down there anytime I wanted, they said that there was a thing called the Elbridge 100, which is it's a website with biographies of the 100 most significant people who've lived in Elbridge. And one of them was Eric Gardner, and they had all of 2 little tiny sentences about him. And they were asking for volunteers to write a biography. So I thought, well, I've come across this bloke a bit. So anyway, I wrote a biography, which is on there, and you can read it. And during my research of it, I also I came across on a genealogical site, Genie, somebody in Greece who claimed that I think it was his great-grandfather was Eric Gardner. And I left a message there, and some months went by, and suddenly I got an email from this Greek lady who was a granddaughter of Eric Gardner. And she then put me on to 2 other granddaughters of Eric Gardner who live in the UK, and they provided various things to me. In particular, for instance, that picture was the only known picture of the man anywhere, but I've got some pictures of him from these granddaughters, and also I got a biography which one of them had typed up, which was her father's biography about his father, Eric. So it just sort of turned into, I thought, I could make a talk about this. So this is the 3rd time I've done it, but this is a special version for Brooklands members because I was very grateful for Andrew Lewis from the museum. Got out a load of archive material a few weeks ago, so I was able to come in here and fill in a few of the gaps in my knowledge. So anyway, I'm going to cover all that stuff up there, basically. There's an awful lot of it, and I hope you'll find it interesting. So, but what sort of guy was he? Because I thought I'd start with this. I'd start with his obituary because I think it's quite significant what it says down there. Can everybody read that? You can. Because, he had colour, it says. He had such an interest in things. It's, and at the time, I mean, this is just one of the things he did, but in a 10-year period, he became an eminent forensic pathologist. which is not how he started his career at all, but that's how he finished it. So, he didn't come from round here. How he ended up in Weybridge is not very clear, but he was born in Hackney. He was brought up in Essex. The family regard Coggeshall in Essex as where they all came from. He went to Cambridge. He studied medicine at Cambridge, and one of the things that his son wrote was that he was a prominent oarsman and stroked his first May boat. Well, I still haven't worked out exactly what stroking a May boat is, but I presume he was a pretty significant rower. And here's a picture of him when he was young. So, quite earnest-looking young chap, but of course nobody ever smiled in these. It wasn't a done thing smiling in photographs or anything, was it? So there's a picture of him when he was doing his medical training, because after Cambridge University he went to the London Hospital, and he learnt a lot more about surgery and pathology in particular in terms of sort of specialisms. Although, of course, back in the day there was no such, there weren't surgical specialities as such. There were, I mean, these days the medical profession is divided up into a whole series of sub-professions, if you like. And he got his first job, presumably after he qualified in 1904, and he worked at the Great Ormond Street Hospital. And there's a picture, and it's Eric by the fireplace, if you can, I think it's him there, so, and you can see all the little small cots for children. So, when he was 29 in 1906, he came to Weybridge, and I think almost certainly he came to Weybridge, because he was probably engaged to be married, and secondly because he probably decided he didn't want to work in a London hospital, and he joined a practice. In today's terminology, I refer to it just as a GP practice. He joined a practice of a doctor who was probably, say, 10 years off retirement and wanted a younger partner. So he actually got married the next year, in 1907, and they had 3 children. So he had, the first son was John Soanes, born in 1908. The second son, called George, who was always known in the family as Pickles, and he was a pilot, and unfortunately he got injured at Alamein in North Africa, and his remains were buried in Bari in the heel of Italy. And then the third son was, in fact, it was James, always known as Jim, who ended up being an army major. And I haven't worked out if there's any connection, but he'd never, after the war, never lived in England, and he lived in Italy, and he married a Greek lady. And he used to run Procter & Gamble in Italy, apparently. So there's a lovely picture of the Eric and Dora's wedding, and it's just such a lovely picture. And there's a picture of his 3 sons. Now that's probably in the 1920s, and John had 2 daughters, who are the granddaughters. Those 2 granddaughters. Then Jim had, and I'm not sure whether that's 2. I don't know what Alexa is, but the ones I've highlighted there are the ones I've been in contact with. And it was this Marina Georgopoulos who contacted me via this genealogical site, and then put me onto the others. So, anybody who knows Weybridge well probably knows where they used to live. I'm not sure exactly when they moved into it, but Portmore House is the one on the right there. Oops, and I've gone on already, but that's Kirkchod's estate agents today. And of course that is one of the most historic houses in Weybridge, and he lived there, or the family lived there, right, probably only moved out after his wife eventually died in 1955. So now the incredible thing about this guy, and I'm just going to kind of, it's like unwrapping a Russian doll or something. he only arrived there in 1906. We'll save for a bit the Brooklands side of it, but within 3 years he was the mayor. I mean, you can't. He was 32, and he was a councillor well before that. So as soon as he got here, somebody must have thought he's an interesting bloke. We'll get him to stand as a councillor. And he was eventually chairman of the council, and he didn't retire as a councillor until 1919. And you can see on there, I mean, that's just an extract on there of, some council notes and things when he was the chairman. And the thing he was almost certainly most well known about around here was that when he was the mayor in 1909, he was effectively the founder of Weybridge Museum, and as there's a bit of that's a bit off the website of, in fact, Elbridge Museum, because that Weybridge Museum turned into Elbridge Museum in 1991, and at the time, that's the council offices there. And if you know Weybridge well, that's NatWest Bank, and that's looking up Baker Street. So, and that's today, of course, is Lloyd's Bank. But and the museum was just one room there. Same as the library, I think, was just one room in the council office. So he obviously wasn't very busy. He was doctor. There's quite a few doctors, amazingly, in Weybridge. Even though it was a village, you have to think about it like this. It was just a village. It only had a few thousand residents. But anyway, he apparently in it says from 1907, there'd always been 2 rowing clubs in Weybridge, and one of them had lain dormant for a bit. And the one rowing club was for what you might call the middle classes, and there's another one for the lower classes, which was the Weybridge Rowing Club, and they were looking to, it says there, for tradesmen and watermen, and they put out a plea to get some people who knew something about how to row properly. And he obviously put his hand up, and he was made a coach of their senior members' team, and they were very successful. And then he went on to be the captain of the club and eventually the president during this First World War. And that's a picture looking from the Thames Street where the Minnow used to be, is now, and that, looking towards Shepperton Lock. So as a medical person, he joined the practice of this Dr. Chappell. And much to my amazement, I only found out last year from an old directory that it's literally it was just in this place in Heathrow, literally almost across the road from where I live, actually. And obviously, like many things, when World War I came along, it disrupted many things like medical practices and things. And when he came back after World War I, he had to restart it. I think he took over the same practice and had to restart it. And then in 1922, him and maybe others in the practice hired Dr. Sam Beer. And anybody who's local as well might well know the name Sam Beer. And we'll come on to him in a bit. And then he decided eventually in 1936 to retire as a GP. And he was still then in a practice with Dr. Beer and another doctor called Whitehurst, who also we'll mention a bit later as well. So some of the things that his son wrote about him in his biography was the fact that he had all this, obviously, expertise from accidents at Brooklands in saving damaged limbs. And what you've got to think about is that how did he get involved with Brooklands? And it's not 100% clear, but it seems to me almost inevitably that you suddenly got this racetrack built in just on the edge of this village, and there was a number of doctors here. He was probably the youngest one, and at some stage pretty soon they realised there was quite a few injuries, and he was probably the one down in the cottage hospital, which we'll come on to, who was kind of up for dealing with these sort of casualties. And you've got to see the context is that he must have been seeing trauma injuries. I mean, that's what people call them these days. They wouldn't have called it trauma injuries then. But they're trauma injuries that today, a good percentage of them would go straight to St George's Hospital in Tooting these days. They wouldn't even go to St Peter's. And I say that because I used to be a governor for 9 years of Ashford and St Peter's hospitals. And because there is nobody in Surrey does brain surgery. There's no neurosurgeons in Surrey. Anybody who's got any head injury, straight to St George's. Anybody who's got injury to more than one limb, straight to St George's these days. And that's because you've got a massive team of all specialities. And a couple of the crashes I'll talk about. I mean, these days, you'd have orthopaedic surgeons, you'd have vascular surgeons, and you could have cosmetic surgeons working to repair damaged limbs, almost certainly. And what he started doing was just working in a hospital down the road, a cottage hospital, which didn't even have an operating theatre. And he was saving people. I mean, it's quite incredible, and it's difficult to kind of overdo that, how complicated it must have been. And one of his, when I was talking to one of his granddaughters, she remembers going into Portmore House as a young girl and saying, oh, grandfather, he had this big wooden operating table in the house. Now, I can't quite work that one out myself, but it's because I'm pretty certain he wasn't operating in the house. But and at that time, he would have been a pathologist, actually, so he was quite used to dissecting bodies. But anyway, that's what she told me. But his son also said, I mean, he wasn't just doing this, he was, a regular doctor anyway, and he was very well known as a gynecologist stroke obstetrician, and that he was very upset that once when he lost a baby, it was the first one he'd ever lost a baby in 30 years. Now, that would have been very, very unusual. And in 1913, in terms of what was happening at the cottage hospital, which at the time had it probably had less than 14 beds. As I say, it didn't have an operating room, but there were 5 doctors who were registered who worked out of the hospital, if you like, And then later on, we'll talk about there was a new hospital built in 1927-28, and he was also, this is quite interesting, he was chairman of the sanitary committee. And I think this is actually not necessarily because he's a doctor, it was because he was a councillor and he was maybe a natural. But that document there, and you can find it online, is absolutely incredible because the local council had responsibility for health. And they had to do, by law, produce annual reports. And there is so much amazing detail in these documents about what happened. I mean, it tells you how many births, how many illegitimate births. It tells you all about sanitary residents with unsanitary housing and all this kind of stuff. And it gives you all the statistics about every single communicable disease that was there. Because the big thing about medicine, really, it wasn't all about operating and things like that. Most of it was about fighting, some of the dreadful diseases, which eventually we got vaccines for and wiped them out. So quite interesting stuff. I mean, amazing things you learn about how many farms there were in Weybridge and how many cows, because they all had to be inspected in terms of the risk from tuberculosis and things. So because of his obviously inquisitive mind and that, he was a bit surprised apparently when he came here to work as a doctor, to find that there was all this local sort of folk medicine and folklore around. And he wrote some of this up, and somebody, it must have been handwritten notes, but somebody typed it all up and eventually got into some, I think there's some Surrey book of it. But he came across these amazing things like a woman coming to him telling him that she'd done the bridges because, you know, her little baby was suffering from what he diagnosed as whooping cough. And I don't believe they had any cure for it. And doing the bridges, apparently, was that you took the baby and you, probably in a pram, and you walked all the way to Chertsey. You went over Chertsey Bridge. You walked all the way then to Shepperton, to Walton Bridge, and then you walked all the way back to Weybridge. And it was supposed to have cured the child. And she was quite disgusted that he didn't have any better thing to offer. And then another woman came and told him that, say, if you skinned and fried a mouse and gave it to the child to eat, that would cure it as well. But, so you can imagine, it's only 100 odd years ago, but there was some quite interesting things there. I won't bother and cover the other ones, but because of his interest in history, and we'll cover archaeology later, but he was always obviously writing things, and he must have been depositing them in the museum, because in 1999 the manager of the museum wrote a book called Weybridge Past, and it's absolutely littered with references to Eric Gardner said this and Eric Gardner did this, and so a whole series of things up there which you can see. But one of the things down the bottom there, it says when there was a fire on Weybridge Heath, it uncovered this place where there'd been, he worked out there'd been iron workings. Now, this is absolutely kind of astonishing for those of us who live here, that you might have known that, like in the Weald and that, they made a lot of charcoal and stuff historically, and of course a lot of that originally was for smelting iron, because that was the Iron Age, and there was iron ore literally in the ground all over the place. And so what you can see there, oh sorry, wrong one. What you can see here, you know, these undulations, and this is just up almost certainly just up the station on the right. So it's all, of course, covered in trees and stuff now, but that's almost certainly iron workings. And I'll come on and cover where he then worked out where they did a lot of the smelting. So, but before that, we'll go on to the Loch Kings, and we'll go into some of the Brooklands connections and things. Now, I'm sure most of you know who Hugh and Ethel Loch King are. They're the people who, him in particular, he owned a huge amount of land. He inherited it from his father. It was all largely put together by his grandfather. But if you drove up from Byfleet, up what is now Brooklands Road, and into Weybridge, what I generally say is he owned everything on the left-hand side of the road, virtually, apart from the bits of the heath. And you went into Weybridge and he owned all of Portmore Park, everything going up to the way and everything. And of course he sold it off over the years, most of it for building development. We won't go into the history of the track and that, but somehow or other, Eric Gardner got very close to them very quickly, and I suspect it must have been because he was developing this reputation. He was the doctor who was dealing with a lot of these accident victims, and they got to know him, and of course we'll come on and talk about him as the medical officer. But he must have known them that well, because his granddaughter told me that her father, John Soames Gardner, Ethel was his godmother. Well, he was only born in 1908. Eric Gardner only arrived here in 1906, so I must have got to know them incredibly well. And I'm pretty certain Eric certainly was at least Hugh's personal physician. And it's very clear, it was reported when Hugh Locke King died in 1926 that, you know, Dr. Gardner was present as his doctor. So he had clearly very, very strong connections with the Locke Kings. And I always thought, in fact, that he became the medical director because of them, but that's a bit unclear, actually. So some of the things that he was dealing with prior to the World War I in relation to Brooklands, obviously I've talked about the injuries and things, and he was eventually made the medical officer, and I'll cover later the distinction between, you know, the medical officer, what they did, and what you do down in the hospital. But he was obviously seeing all these accidents and that. But one of the things his son said is that after the World War I, he was given the absolute power to stop any driver racing. And I imagine that might be something which is current these days, but he was obviously perceived as somebody who could really judge people, and you know, and I imagine that at race meetings, if stewards or anything thought, you know, somebody was drunk or, you know, not quite there, or, you know, had a bit of an accident and was a bit woozy or something, you know, he had the right to just stop them completely taking part anymore. But the big thing we're working up to is head injuries and concussion, because this was the big thing that he was seeing. And of course there were no helmets worn then. And but also he came across, of course, flying accidents, because somebody will tell me when flying started. Was it 1908, 1909? But you know, people started falling to the ground in aeroplanes. But when he was, he must have also been on the site when they were literally building in 1907, because he discovered Roman coins by the side of the railway straight and gave them to the British Museum. So this bit is kind of new, because I'm grateful to Andrew Lewis, the museum, who let me in and see some of the archives. And we had to comb through a lot of things to try and understand what was a medical officer, because it wasn't really very obvious to a lot of people, but it's very clear from all the programmes that the medical officer was a track official, and who was, if you like, appointed by the race operator. And there's many of you here who know a lot more about how racing took place at Brooklands, but as soon as Brooklands was formed, a club, the Brooklands Automobile Racing Club, was formed, and they operated largely the racing on behalf of Brooklands Weybridge Limited, which was the company that the Locke Kings owned. And obviously they got a lot of the proceeds, presumably, in terms of the entry money and all that. But there were other race operators as well, so there's a whole series of clubs. And when you look at all the programmes, they all say who the medical officer was. So there's a British Motorcycle Racing Club, the Cycle Car Club, which eventually became the Junior Car Club, and then there was a British Racing Drivers Club. And his name features as medical officer on all of them, basically. And I think the reality is that the medical officer was the person who had to be there and pass judgment on things. But of course, normally it wouldn't be the doctor who would then go on and treat people. But in his case, he was the doctor who was doing most of the treatment of the people, because they were just taken down to the cottage hospital. But there was, what we've discovered is that there were in fact a number of medical officers. The first one we could find was in 1909, and then there was a guy who did it for 3 years, and then it was Gardner, and he did it until 1936, so he was by far the longest serving. And then eventually his colleague, when he did retire from general practice, he decided obviously not to be the medical officer here anymore. And his colleague in his practice took over, Dr. Whitehurst. But he personally was a member of, he's listed there as a member of the BARC, right from 1911, right through to the demise of the track. And with the Junior Car Club, he's listed as the chief medical officer, and I think the thinking was there that they operated a lot of long-distance races, like 200-mile races. And he would have had, and we'll come on to it, but people like Sam Beer would come along on race days as well and help out. And one of the things I should say is that it wasn't just race days, it wasn't just Saturdays. There was people using the track during the week, because one of the whole things about Brooklands was it was about giving manufacturers and people a place to try out their machines and test them. And so there were plenty of people coming off motorbikes during the middle of the week, not just on race days. But the first thing you find out sort of written about were about flying accidents. So May 1912, Flight magazine reported about this accident of a Flanders F3 monoplane, where the pilot and the passenger were killed. And they reported that Dr. Gardner gave this medical report because there was an inquest held in Weybridge, and it was him who reported. And you can read up there, in fact, I'm not sure that bit was from, that might have been from a national newspaper, all that bit in red, but it must have been at some sort of event, or it must have been at the weekend, because there were 200 people, they reckon, there who saw the crash. And what was very significant about this, it's not connected to Gardner, but this is the very first air accident that was investigated, and it's the start of air accident investigations in the whole world. And that was all because 3 months before, the Royal Aero Club had set up this committee to look at things. So it became routine, and of course, as we all know, any aircraft crashes, there's an investigation these days. So that's the plane. It's quite an interesting looking plane, I thought, that, for 1912. And apparently those are pictures of the actual plane itself. And then the next year, in 1913, Flight wrote up another one about another accident where the pilot was injured and his passenger was killed, and they were taken to Weybridge Hospital. And you might be able to read there that when they wrote this, the pilot was still in a critical condition in Weybridge. And what I thought was significant here in terms of the lead up to things is this thing here saying that the cause, Gardner said the cause of death was a fractured skull, and he was asked about whether, if they had worn helmets, whether it would have prevented the injuries, and he basically said no, it wouldn't. So there again, this is just showing us that people would very often die because of head injuries, basically. So one of the things that we got out of the archive was, this is a September 1924 Brooklands Gazette, which I assume is the kind of magazine that Brooklands members got. Somebody might confirm that. Which mentions that 3 or 4 years before the war, a number of Autocycle Union officials, headed by Dr. Gardner, started investigating head injuries and safeguarding them. And so that's the first kind of written reference there is to anything about what turned out to be helmets. And of course, the Autocycle Union was the national body responsible for all motorcycle racing, and still is today, I think. So most of these motorcycle riders at Brooklands, here's one, and he's got his nice leather helmet here. And of course, it didn't really do anything at all if you came off the bike. And what Gardner realised is that, and this could only have been through actually seeing multiple instances of this is that the rider coming off would follow a trajectory, which is a parabolic curve, basically, and would hit the track. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is, A, you could smash your head so badly, obviously it crushed the skull and things. But if that didn't happen, if there was in any way the head started moving at a different velocity than the body, that almost certainly meant the head would go back and break the neck. And that means total paralysis or death. And he had seen a lot of these motorcycle riders coming into his hospital with concussion from hitting the head. And they stayed in the cottage hospital for weeks and some of them months. And actually quite a lot of them recovered, as long as they didn't have literal physical injuries to the brain. And quite interestingly, we could only find that there was ever 3 motorcycle fatalities at Brooklands in all those years it operated. I said, I kind of tried to give the impression how these injuries must have been so unusual for a village cottage hospital to ever see. The speed limit was only 20 miles an hour, whereas around here you could be going around 100 miles an hour. And his son said he was seeing motorcycle injuries every 2 weeks, which is quite a lot. And the work they obviously did, he was put on to a guy called Mr. Moss of Bethnal Green. Well, it turned out Mr. Moss was the guy who made, a big manufacturer of police helmets. And of course, police helmets are extremely hard helmets, but relatively light. And the spec was basically about, it had to be stiff enough to withstand a very heavy blow and smooth enough to glance off a surface, and shouldn't have any projections, which means no visors or badges or anything like that, so that basically the head could just sort of roll along. And that paper I showed from the Gazette there, that's the only thing I've come across which diagrammatically shows a kind of cutaway of the helmet there. Now, this is from 1924, and that's got a visor. I'm pretty certain it says it's detachable, but he certainly wouldn't have approved of that at all. But you can see the principle here, that you had this very, very hard shell, and of course it's almost conical. Well, it's like an egg, isn't it? And you had a very tight lacing, so there's a leather inner and all linked to the strap and going on the chin, so it was very, very tight on the head, basically. It was only after World War I they became compulsory. All motorcycle racing had to wear a helmet after 1920. And Gardner says that 16 years afterwards he only had 2 hospital cases, which is incredible since he was seeing 2 a week beforehand. And they became known, and if you're of a certain age, certainly I am, people used to refer to helmets as skid lids, and it was because he realised you wanted the head to skid along. And almost certainly, from the way the comment was made by his son in his biography, they probably wished he patented it, so that he'd got something out of it. But I'm pretty certain he wasn't interested in monetary wealth or anything. And just about the Autocycle Union, they, because of the work that was done by him, and because in 1913 there'd been somebody had died at the senior TT races, they decided to force all the riders, made it compulsory to wear a helmet, and they took 94 helmets made by this Mr. Moss to the Isle of Man, and they eventually made them compulsory in 1922. And you can read the comment there from the medical officer in the Isle of Man to Eric Gardner. He wrote to him and called them "your damned helmets" because it had done him out of an interesting medical observation of people who'd got head injuries. Right, so much to my absolute amazement, I went along to the Auto Jumble here in July 2016 after I'd done this sort of research, and I saw this table and I was absolutely gobsmacked to see this thing here, because I am pretty certain that's a totally original helmet, and I inspected it and things, and I said to the guy, did he know anything about it, and he hadn't a clue, and it was chalked on it 20, and I couldn't make out the rest of it, and I thought it was £20, and I was going to say I'll buy it. In fact, I'd have given it to the museum probably. But he said, no, it's 200. So I declined to pay 200 for it. But I'm pretty certain that's an original one. And what's interesting, the museum doesn't have, I mean, the museum's got nothing about this at all. It's quite surprising almost. It has got some helmets if you go around. At least one of them looks quite like that, but it was a late 1930s one. But I'm pretty certain that's an original helmet. But just to continue the story, which is not to do with Eric, well, it links into him later, but the story of helmets for motorcyclists is centres around Lawrence of Arabia and a very, very eminent neurosurgeon called Sir Hugh Cairns. Probably most of you know Lawrence of Arabia. It was very, I mean, in the 1930s, well, after the First World War, I mean, he was a massively well-known kind of celebrity-type person. He was a serving RAF officer most of the time, and he loved riding his Brough Superior SS100 motorbike. And unfortunately, in 1935, he crashed it. Not on duty or anything. He crashed it and he had terrible head injuries and he died 6 days later. And Cairns was probably the most eminent, if you like, brain surgeon around at the time. And he went, and you know, this was like a national figure who was injured, and he went down there and he was so moved by, you know, this person dying of these head injuries, he decided to start investigating it himself. Now later on, I'll show you something where in fact Sam Beer reckons that they used to call him in occasionally for patients at Weybridge, but that wasn't very obvious. But he was an advisor to the government, and it was because of his research that the military introduced helmets in 1941 for anybody riding a motorbike. And apparently before then, in the first 2 years of the war, Second World War, over 2,000 riders died through head injury. Well, they died having accidents on motorcycles, and the vast majority with head injuries. Astonishing. And of course it took another 32 years till 1973 till they were made compulsory for all riders, which is quite incredible really when you think about it. And there's a lot of us here probably remember 1973 quite well. But and the final take on the whole thing was that in 1941 there's Professor Cairns, he wrote this learned paper in the British Medical Journal, the BMJ, which is called Head Injuries in Motorcyclists. And it was obviously a big article. And Eric Gardner decided to write a very long letter in response to it, and it's there and that. He goes into great detail, and he basically explained that 27 years earlier he had worked out all this stuff about what was a good helmet design. And he didn't actually think that Cairns had properly taken it all into account, was the sort of the summary of it, which is really quite interesting. So it's a very, very interesting read, actually. If anybody wants it, I've got it as a Word document these days. So this is a picture. This is the only picture of Eric at the track, and as you can see, he's with two other gentlemen who were almost certainly track officials. This one being policeman. I had a discussion about Tim, about what he might be as a rank and that, we don't know. And this is almost certainly somebody else who's a track official, and I suspect that's late 20s, early 30s, just because of the hats and things. But you can see he was obviously very elegantly dressed when he was there and that, with his gloves and everything. And so he wouldn't have been doing any kind of hands-on medical work while he was there, I don't think. So just a few words about Dr. Sam Beer, and say a few things later as well. But he became the most well-known surgeon in the area, and he actually started assisting Eric Gardner from 1922 onwards. And it's pretty clear he eventually probably took most of the workload, and particularly after Eric stopped being the medical officer, he was the major surgeon in the area and dealt with all the difficult Brooklands cases almost certainly. And he's obviously a much more sort of jolly character. The picture there is when he just left Buckingham Palace because he was awarded an OBE military for his war service in the World War I. And that's a picture of him probably in the 50s, around when he retired. And they worked on, as I say, various crashes. Now, this is a very well-known one, and this car is very well known because if you walk around the museum, you have seen that every time you walk around the cars. And that's Lord Ridley's special car, and he had, and we're obscuring the pictures are obscuring some of the text there, but he had a very spectacular crash in it, completely smashed up the car, and was taken into Weybridge Hospital. And then in his memoirs, you can probably read that about how he ploughed through corrugated iron fence, down a bank into a wood. I was concussed, and a branch of a tree went through my leg, and taken to Weybridge Hospital, there for 2 months, and basically Dr. Gardner saved his leg because he thought it was going to be cut off. So, quite something. He was obviously very pleased about this. And then another accident, Sammy Davis was a very, very well-known driver, also in 1931, and his car slipped down the banking, just coming off the members' banking, slipped down, and he fell out, and the car landed on top of him, and it smashed his femur, his thigh bone up in a number of places, very, very severe injury. And he wrote... I think he had a column, actually, an autocar, and he wrote afterwards, as you can read there, if he had been a racing car, he would now bear a brass plate stating that it had been reconstructed by Bear and Gardner. So it's really quite significant what these guys did, and people obviously realise, what an amazing job it was that they did. So... I'm afraid we're going to put most of the Brooklands stuff behind us and go back to some of the other things that he did. And there again, he wasn't very busy, was he, before World War I, just going backwards, but he was a big mainstay of the Surrey Archaeological Society, and eventually became a vice president. He was a member probably for years, and he was the honorary local secretary for Weybridge. And every single town in Surrey had a local representative. And it will come on and cover some of the things he did. But there's other things there, like Oatlands Palace he did. But just to put this into context, how big archaeology was locally in Surrey, the society still exists today, and if you just look at the people involved here, the Lord Lieutenant of Surrey was the president, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Duke of Northumberland, the 2 earls, and eventually right down the bottom they're the Lord Chief Justice of England. It's just quite amazing actually how big, and it started in the Victorian times, you know, people were digging up all over the place. So his most notable thing that Eric did was he went and excavated St George's Hill. So you go straight up there and up the hill, and over the road, up the hill. You'd come to this camp, which was known about. And what you've got to understand is that up until 1911, anybody could walk on St George's Hill. It was privately owned by Mr. Edgerton, and you could just go. There's paths all over it. You go up there, but eventually Edgerton sold it to I think it's George Tarrant, who built all the first houses and set up the St George's Hill Golf Club and etc. etc. So Eric went and did an excavation in 1910. He published a report in 1911. It got some publicity, in particular an article in The Spectator. So it's sort of, and it's almost certainly because there was, it wasn't 100% clear what the origins of the camp were. And that's a picture out of his report, and you can see the track. He just mentions the track there. And the camp's up here, and some of these are contours, but he also worked out that there were paths down from St George's Hill, because he worked out that there was iron ore on St George's Hill, and that was transported down to where it was smelted by some of the paths. It should say camp there, but it's hidden. This is an extract from the 1914 Ordnance Survey map, and probably why the interest was because the map there says it's a British camp occupied by Caesar before he crossed the Thames at Cowie Stakes, which of course is Cowie Sale by Walton Bridge today. And this is what people thought, and that's a massive area. Put that into context, there are 12 mansions today cover that area. And the only building at the time on St George's Hill was the Swiss Cottage Tea Room. And this was an incredibly well-known place because at weekends people would walk from Weybridge all over St George's Hill and go and have tea in the tea room. And they'd also look at the camp, presumably, while they were there. There were sort of ramparts and things. And apparently Elbridge Council own a very tiny bit of it, but most of it is in the gardens of mansions up there. So he was also very well known for what he did at Chertsey as well. And what you see here that's a poster advertising a talk he gave to raise funds for building the new hospital, and called The Romance Tiles of Chertsey Abbey. And it was a lantern lecture, which quite significant in those days, because he actually was able to show slides or pictures via what they called a lantern. And he obviously didn't really write this up as a paper or anything, because his son, this bottom bit here, is in reference. It's his son with somebody else in 1954 wrote it up based on his work. He also did other things. He wrote a paper about prehistoric and Saxon antiquities found around Weybridge, and on the right there is a load of pictures of stuff. They're all found around the bridge, the old Weybridge, basically, all those things. And he wrote other stuff, apparently. I don't know the detail or anything, but one of the significant things, and I put it in here as well because it's in the Brooklands estate, and he worked out that on this bit of the farm, Brooklands Farm, which is north of the racetrack, this is where smelting had gone. gone on. And what's significant there again is that there's a bit of land there and there's a 50-foot contour, and this bit of land clearly doesn't flood, and because of it being not like the museum here, which of course we all know does flood or has a tendency to. And he worked out that iron smelting had gone on this bit of land here, and it's the closest point to the river which doesn't flood. There's nowhere closer when you look at it. And he discovered this, of course, is the racetrack here, River Wey going under there. And later on, years and years later, in fact, I think in the middle of the 1960s, people looked at it, and eventually a proper archaeological dig was done over 1970 and 1971. What at the time was the playground for a lot of the kids who lived in the Loch King estate. And so they dug it up, and you can see, of course, this is actually part of a working farm. That's harvesting a crop there. You can see but this was the fields that were cut off when the railway, cut off these fields from the rest of the farm. And of course, wrong one. I pressed the wrong button, Tim, so... Oh, that's it, I'm okay. Of course, today it's the sewage works, and that's why they had to rush to do an excavation, because Surrey County Council bought the site to put a new sewage works on. And so you can't go and see it anymore. So. And there's a whole report, massive detailed report about the things they found. And in particular, in medieval times, there was a large medieval house there, and that must have been one of the earliest settlements in the area. So let's come on to Eric and World War I, because he was quite busy in World War I. Of course, big things happened here at Brooklands in World War I. And he, probably almost certainly because of this thing that he was good at assessing people, and the RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, wanted to recruit and train an awful lot of new pilots, and he was involved in developing means for selecting and assessing, and this is from his son again, medical and psychological fitness and suitability of candidates. And he was also, though, at the same time, the medical officer for what was known as the Red Cross local committee, and there was what is known as the restoration at Weybridge. I've no idea where it was, but he was also medical officer for 2 auxiliary hospitals, which was Brooklands House 1 and Cairns Hill House. Of course, both of those owned by the Loch Kings, their own actual house at Brooklands House. And many of you will know that Ethel Loch King ran over 20 of these auxiliary hospitals in Surrey, and that's why she was made a dame after the war. And there again, of course, he knew her incredibly well. And, but he got eventually called up for service in 1917 to the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he went to Macedonia, where the British Army were aiding Serbs against Germany. And he was a lieutenant and got promoted eventually and mentioned in dispatches. And apparently he didn't come back after the war ended in 1918. He had to stay on, and he was involved with some ambulance train, presumably taking injured soldiers somewhere or other. In fact, Baku's quite a long way away, isn't it, when you think about it? But back to Brooklands here. I didn't know all the detail here, but basically Loch King just gave the War Department the whole of Brooklands, handed it over to them. They obviously had powers to take things over anyway. There were at least 4 flying schools in Brooklands. It was by far the largest centre for training pilots in the whole country. the War Department took it over. They took over all the buildings, all the aircraft, all the pilots, and they formed a thing called the Military Training School out of the Bristol Vickers and the Sopwith flying schools. And it was well recorded that there were very few deaths resulting over this period, basically, and almost certainly because of the quality of the training, and probably affected as well by the fact that they'd screened the potential pilots in terms of their suitability. So I think yes, no, that's right. So so we're whipping to North Greece now. I hadn't a clue that the British Army was fighting in Greece in the First World War. Such a concentration on Belgium and France. But it was called the Salonika Campaign, and they were in northern Greece there. Thessalonica is I think it's the second city in Greece. And where they were fighting was a place called Amphipolis, or whatever it is. And this is an ancient, archaic, Hellenistic Greek cemetery. And it's over a vast area. I mean, probably miles and miles of it. And I've seen things like this in Turkey. And they were in this whole area and being shelled, and lots of shells hit tombs, split tombs open. And the picture on there is some British soldiers holding up skulls that had got out of broken tombs. But when Eric was there, being the good archaeologist he was, he actually came across things, quite valuable objects. And instead, you can kind of reason why this happened. He thought, well, it's just crazy leaving this. We're in a war zone, it's just this stuff littered around. I better take them away. And he eventually brought them home and gave them to the British Museum. And much to my amazement, when I was researching this, there was a mini Elgin marbles thing came up in October 2014, because some people in Greece are demanding that the British Museum gave back all these things that he took. And down here, they had to issue a public letter about the situation, and they actually didn't think that the things he took were to do with, because it was currently then being excavated in a big way, and it has been over many years. And they're basically saying these aren't appropriate things in relation to what you're currently doing. So that was quite interesting. And there's some pictures of the things he brought back, and you can read what they are, and you can go and see them in the British Museum, or they're there somewhere anyway. Right, back to hospitals, medical things. So there's a picture of the Cottage Hospital in Weybridge, and that's a picture in 1912. The building's still there today. It's actually been extensively modified. It doesn't have this lovely canopied entrance off Balfour Road. And that's it there on the map. You can see it on the map there. And, you could almost say that Eric almost worked on the job, because his house is about 50 yards away. So he'd just come out of his house, turn right, and go to the hospital. And when the new hospital was built, he had to turn left and walk about 150 yards to go to the new one. So he would have been a very well-known person in Weybridge, because it was quite significant where he lived. People would have seen him all the time. And probably in the hospital, they could go and send somebody to knock on his door and call him out when they needed to. So, Weybridge was growing. Lots more people living here. It became a very desirable place to live. Back in about 1860, there was only 1,600 people, I think, in Weybridge. I think by about 1907, there was about 6,000 people. And the old Cottage Hospital couldn't cope. So a decision was made in 1923 to find a site for a new hospital. A building committee was set up. In those days, things like this were all funded by public subscription. There was no health service. Local communities got themselves together, set up if you like, a charity these days, trustees and things, and started seeking funds. And Eric became the chairman of the building committee. That was the one that was responsible for trying to raise money and look for a site. And I don't want to go into all the details, but just you saw on the previous slide on that map, there was a site which was Vigo House. It was owned by Hugh King, and in fact Eric had already had stuff from the auxiliary hospital at Brooklands house moved down there after requesting that of Lock King. So he went to talk to him about could they have the Vigo House site for a new hospital, and Hugh King said you can have it for nothing. This is very interesting because even today people know that the hospital site, and most of you are local will probably know the hospital that was there that burnt down in 2017. Many people understand that the land, the site was gifted for a hospital. The reality is that when the NHS came into being, it took over all existing hospitals, and therefore the site is owned by the NHS actually. But so the building was completed in 1927. It was opened by Princess Beatrice, the last of Queen Victoria's daughters, and it was a huge event in Weybridge. And when after it was opened, Eric was on the board of governors, and he was chairman of the contributory scheme right up until 1948. That was the scheme where a lot of people effectively insured themselves by making a weekly contribution, so that if they needed hospital care, it would be paid for. And that's a picture of Vigo House at the time, with a great big board there, please help. So that's 1927. And there's lots of pictures around of the opening of the hospital, and I put this one in purely because is that Eric Gardner? You know, he was a tall bloke, and you could see he held himself very well, much better than I do. He must have been there. He was such a significant person in terms of the building of the thing. But of course, the world and his wife was there that day. This is Princess Beatrice there, quite an old lady at the time, and. Yeah, I mean, I've got other pictures. I mean, it was a huge crowd. It must have been one of the biggest things that happened in Weybridge. And that was a picture of it very early on. And how did it play a role? Well, I've obviously talked about the cottage hospital and people being taken down there. As Brooklands built up, and particularly in the 30s, and they actually started to have an ambulance, and the first one they got was a Ford Model T based one, which is that picture up there, and later on they got a Buick one, that picture down there. And so every race day they had to have, the ambulance had to be on standby with a driver, and of course doctors had to be on call as well. So it's quite significant, and when you think this is kind of like every other weekend from April through to October, they had to be available, you know, racing up to the track. And you know, he took all these early cases, and I've said about Sambir assisting him as well very much. And in there's a booklet about the history of the hospital, which said that these drivers were a bit difficult. They thought they were lords of creation, and in fact Sambir also says that a lot of their mates came in and tried to interfere with the treatment they were having. And this, you know, it made a lot of difficulties. They weren't just typical patients, basically, but they had a very stern matron who sorted them out. So, and this is, I mentioned about Sambir and that when he was retired he retired in the late 50s. It was the 60th anniversary of Brooklands, and there was a magazine called Old Motor, and they did the June edition was all basically about Brooklands, and they had this article about the track surgeon, which was based on an interview with him, and he told them all sorts of things. and he told them about his own motorbikes and cars, and he talked about some of the major accidents, and he talked about how he knew a lot of these big-time racers who were, real kind of celebrities in those days, because he'd dealt with them and, met them on the track, had them in the hospital, so really quite interesting stuff. So, 1936, Eric decided to give up all this medical stuff, living bodies, and go on to looking into dead bodies, basically. And he got the role of the pathologist for the Surrey coroner. And one of the first things, when his son wrote about this, he was horrified to find that when he came, he had to do an autopsy, a post-mortem, that the technicians had already started cutting open the bodies. And he was just thought this was appalling, and he had to stop it. And you've all watched, CSI or whatever, and things on the TV, so you've seen lots of these things. Every single post-mortem he did is written up and is in the Surrey History Centre in Woking, actually. And he became very eminent as a pathologist. It's very clear. I mean, that opening thing of his obituary, was from this Society of Pathologists, forensic ones. And he worked with this guy called Professor Keith Simpson, who was very, very esteemed pathologist himself, and also with Sir Bernard Spilsbury, who was a top Home Office pathologist, who was obviously brought in for very significant events. And of course, the big thing was murders. And I think what you've got to understand is that although murders get reported today, the press really loved murders, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. They were big things. And a number of the murder cases that Eric dealt with were written up, basically. So this Simpson guy, he had a secretary, and he decided to take her out. She used to write up all his reports, and he decided to take her out to witness some post-mortems. And the first one she went to was in Weybridge, of Miss Salmon, who lived at the Nook, Weybridge, wherever that was, killed by a drunken lodger. And Eric was working on it, and he got Simpson in on it. And the most notable thing, she says, you can read it there, about how the mortuary was surrounded by great scarlet dahlias and drowsy September bees. So, but the book, she wrote this whole book. That was the first murder in it, and it was made into a TV series. But another book that came out was Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in Guildford. And one of the big ones in there was the Wigwam Girl, the brutal death of Joan Pearl Wolfe. And this was a big one for Eric. And there again, he had Simpson involved in it. And a body was discovered on an army training ground. And that's a picture out of the book, and I have no idea if you can identify anything in that pile of whatever. But this was one of these things. This was one of the ones that was followed very much by the press, and eventually they worked out what had happened. Basically, very much with the skills of Eric involved. And then the final one is the Chalk Pit murder. A whole book written about this really, really big national interest case in 1946. A body was found in a chalk pit in Woldingham. The police just decided it was a suicide. Eric didn't think that was the case. It wasn't obvious to him. It was and the police wanted to close it. And his son said he spent long hours in the chalk pit, in all hours, all weather, without eating properly. And he was vindicated. I mean, people didn't believe him. They thought, no, you've just been stupid. And he was vindicated because he did eventually prove that this body had been murdered, and they found the perpetrator, and there was a trial at the Old Bailey. But unfortunately, that was the final major activity in his career because it eventually left him with tuberculosis, and that's what killed him eventually. But just another little amusing thing. I just love this. You can read what it says there. That's another letter to the British Medical Journal about dead bodies floating, and you can read what it says. But he'd obviously seen an awful lot of bodies recovered from the Thames and the Wey, and everybody told him that a woman after death floats face downward, but a man floats on his back. And in the letter there, it actually references ancient writing about it as well. But the very last thing about him is he was a map collector, and he was renowned as a collector of Speed atlases. And John Speed was the English Mercator. He was the most famous cartographer we've ever had, and there it was a world authority. He owned a large collection. He donated lots of them to Archaeological Society, and his finest one is in Cambridge University. And before we get on to that, though, does anybody recognise that Brooklands plan? Not a soul recognises that. Well, that's probably the oldest exhibit in this museum, and every day hundreds of people walk by it. But nobody takes any notice of it. And that is a map which he owned, and he donated it to Weybridge Museum, and it's on permanent loan to the museum from what is now Elbridge Museum. And that's the plan from 1803 when the Duke of York sold all his properties, including the Brooklands estate. And it's got on there, it's got a key at the top with all these things that are marked on there. And I've just put on there, it's quite significant because there was what was called then Great Brooklands House, and that was on Members Hill. And the Brooklands Farm is on there as well. So he obviously wrote loads of stuff about speed atlases, and somebody else, he was going to write a book about it, but he died before he could, and somebody else wrote it up as a book in 1970, basically. And that's a picture of this very, very valuable map. Well, it's an atlas, and an atlas just means a set of maps. And it was the very first atlas of all the British counties. And he had this early proof copy, which was hand-coloured and was different than the first edition. And according to Cambridge University, it's one of their greatest treasures they have. It's probably absolutely priceless. And it's known as the Gardner copy. One of his granddaughters told me that the two sons, after his death, inherited all these, well, a whole load of these things, maps, but her mother got very, very annoyed with her husband and his brother, and they were selling them off, and she said, "You've got to keep some of these things," and they kept 4 of them, and she eventually sold the last one in 2013, which is like a world atlas from 16, whatever it was. So there we are. As I said, he fell ill with tuberculosis. He stayed in Switzerland, very common, of course. People who got TB left the country, went to Switzerland for the mountain air. He spent 2 sessions there. He wrote about Weybridge Hospital when he was there, but eventually he passed away in 1951. And he's buried just down the cemetery on Brooklands Lane, as is his wife, and very close to where all the Lock Kings are buried. So that's it. So
lovely. Well, thank you, Steve.
I'll put that down.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we've learnt a lot about Dr. Gardner there, and a lot about local history as well, that some of us may not have known. So certainly lots to think about there. Now, do we have any questions in the audience at all? Well, he's been quite extensive there, so he's covered quite a lot of stuff, I think. But if anyone else wants to know a little bit more, please wave your hand now, or we'll move straight on to the raffle.
Or any corrections of anything, anything I've, people have got different views of things, but...
Okay, yeah, we do have one there. Let's move over.
Paul.
Okay.
The Elbridge Museum used to be in the top of the library, didn't it?
Yep.
What's its status now?
Well, it's effectively a virtual museum run out of the Borough Council offices in Esher. So, and they put on odd displays of things, but virtually most of it's online now. Well, they put on sort of online exhibitions and things. I mean, very recently they've done a whole thing about high streets in Elbridge and lots of pictures of the high streets and things. But
I remember there was the dugout logboat there and things like that. So they have artifacts.
I would never have done this talk and my other talk if it hadn't been for the fact that I could just walk into the museum any day I liked, and they got things out which they just had in filing cabinets, which today they can't tell me they've got, because they've asked them for a complete list of everything to do with Eric Gardner, and given he was the honorary curator for the whole life of it till he died, and they can't find things that I read, and in fact some of the things I had copied.
Yeah, it was a sad day when the museum moved out of there, I think.
Yeah.
Still, some of the stuff came here as well.
And they got rid of, I mean, I'll tell you, just because of coming here, they used to, there's a big book about motorcycling in Brooklands, which name escapes me, and they used to have a copy of it, so I went to try and get it, and they reorganised the library about 2 or 3 years ago, and they got rid of a load of these old books. It used to be a reference book, and it's all gone. And it's worth 50 quid. Yeah. And they obviously just got rid of it.
Yeah, great shame. Okay, any more questions before we move along? So, have a good Easter, everyone, and thank you very much. And thank you very much to Steve McCarthy again for tonight's talk.